answering your questions. You are listening to No Other Doctrine. This radio-on-demand show is pre-recorded.
Our faith should stand the test of time. To do that, it needs to be built on a foundation of solid doctrine. The Apostle Paul urges us in 1 Timothy 4:15 to give our attention to reading, exhortation, and doctrine. That's never been more important than it is now. Welcome to No Other Doctrine. This is your opportunity to call in with your questions live on the radio. Questions about doctrine, religion, and reasons for your faith. You can call in now at 338-5790. During the next hour, Pastor Scott Tom will answer your questions as we discover why doctrines of the Bible are the only ones that will remain for all eternity. Call with your questions now at 338-5790. That's 338-5790. And join us for No Other Doctrine.
Good morning and welcome to the live call-in show, No Other Doctrine with Pastor Scott Tom. And this is the show that asks the question, how many months are there in a light year? And here's Pastor Scott Tom. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. In a light year. Yeah. Is that like less fat in the year or, light year?
Yeah, something to ponder.
Coming to a store near you. Well, welcome into No Other Doctrine. We're pleased that you're listening this morning. A little bit drizzly outside this morning. Some rain and snow, which we always can use here in Albuquerque. We're looking at anthropology, or the study of man, and we started with the beginning, the origins. And we've been going through, we looked a little bit at evolution and creationism, and came to understand that evolution is making a claim mostly based on the fossil record and small, minute changes that they see in species that are current, living, and came up with the whole conclusion on the origin of man. And then we've gone through just a number of things that evolution cannot answer, that they've not come up with really the evidence, and other things that it just generally falls way, way short of what we see. So what we're doing is we're looking at these two and saying what best fits reality, what best gives you the answers. We see that in every instance that creation gives us the best answers. And because of this, we look at the fossil record, and we see that it comes up light for the evolutionists. And this is the hard evidence. We've been looking at other evidences, like evolution has no answer for the immaterial, the soul, the intellect of people, for morality, guilt, all those types of things. But in hard evidence, have they come up and offered us anything tangible? And it really is coming to an end here. Evolution is not just on shaky ground. They're in midair without a platform. And so if you look at the fossil record, we've been doing this for about 150 years now, looking at the fossil record, gathering fossils. And it kind of, I think, is in most people's minds that there is still just a great number of fossils yet to find out there, and that the missing link and all these links are still out there. But that really isn't the case. Because if you look at creatures in specific orders or kinds, and you may call them species if you want, that they're almost completely documented in the fossil record now. That this means that the total fossil record seems to be complete. There's a small portion that isn't represented, but most every order or kind or species is represented in the fossil record. But there are no transitional fossils, not even in the most recent species. So to back this up, let me give you some quotes from some people that are experts in the area, and one is from Dr. Michael Denton. Now, he's not a believer. He's a professed agnostic, but he's a decided non-evolutionist. He doesn't have an answer, but he says evolution can't be it. Now, see, he doesn't believe in God, but he also says the evidence for evolution, at least in the fossil record, there is none. So he's compiled a chart on the adequacy of the fossil record in his book, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And by comparing the number of living types or kinds or species to fossil types, that he then gleaned from that information and took that from other evolutionists, like Romer's classic book, Vertebrate Paleontology. Okay, so he's not going just on his own. He's not saying, I'm making this up, but he's going to the evolutionists and saying, how do they classify these things? Okay, and so he's used Romer's classic books used in colleges and whatnot, the Vertebrate Paleontology, and he's found this. Now listen to this. 97.7 of living orders of terrestrial vertebrates, so it's not the fish, not the birds, but of land animals, are found as fossils. Orders of larger groupings of families, which are larger than the basic setup there, are called species, or the orders or the kinds. So this is kind of in the sense of the biblical kind, when God in Genesis 1 talks about each after their own kind. So you'd include like wolf with the dog kind and vice versa. So when you put this together, what is he saying? He's saying, okay, now you think that there's still all these fossils and we should be finding all these kinds. It's kind of like if you had an explosion in a car factory and you went into the car factory and you said, okay, now parts of the cars were destroyed, but we have enough to kind of piece together the car. And so where does this door go? Well, this door goes over here with this Civic. And well, where does this trunk go? It goes over here with this Camry or whatever car that's in there. And pretty soon you're piecing these cars together, and then you have, you're getting down to just a handful of pieces. You're not necessarily sure where they go, but you're saying from what we knew, pretty much presumed was in the factory, we didn't know exactly what was in the factory. We can pretty much now tell you what was in it because there's not many other fossils that are out there that are showing us anything different. We believe that this was a factory that was, say, a Honda factory. Okay. And because of that, we can now tell you that there were no other cars out there. There were only Hondas. There was one Toyota's, probably employees. Toyota that was in the factory, and here you go. It's kind of the same thing. Now, understand there aren't just hundreds of fossils that they've categorized. There's not thousands of fossils that they've categorized. There's not even millions of fossils that they've categorized. They've categorized over 1 billion fossils out there. Billions upon billions, actually. In one place, in the Natural History Museum in London, they actually have 65 million fossils there. 65 million fossils in that one site. No transitional fossils. After doing this for 150 years now, with the idea that they're trying to find some transitional fossils, they've now said 97.7 of all kinds or all types of animals, land animals, have been identified. So, in other words, of all the parts that we found, they belong to these cars, and there's nothing in between this. There's no transitional cars. You know what I'm saying? So, no matter how much more they dig, the chances of them finding something like a transitional fossil is slim to none. it's probably microscopic, probably less than 1/100% chance. It's down to almost be a miracle now if you could find any transitional form or fossil. So it isn't just that they're still looking and they should find these things out there. They're just not out there to be found. Because after you've compiled this and you've said, well, almost 100% of all the kinds and groupings that we have are represented, it should be that you have billions upon billions of the transitional fossils, because it has slight changes and over time. So you should see skeletal structure changes, especially from so-called reptiles into flying creatures or vice versa, and from the fish to amphibians and amphibians on. You should have millions upon billions of those transitional fossils. So they should be more in abundance than the kinds and types that we know of. And yet, they're just not there. So it leaves us with the idea that everything that they've come up with in their evolutionary chart is really kind of made up. It's just conjecture. And you can say, well, what about these Neanderthals and other types of creatures like Nebraska man and Java man and all these things we read about in our textbooks and stuff? Well, do you know that most of those were actually frauds or based on a single tooth? Like Nebraska man was based on a single tooth. And after all the trials and the whole things that came up with this, it came that they finally identified it as a pig's tooth and not a man's tooth or this so-called Neanderthal man. But do you see those retractions that come out in your science books or your kids' textbooks? No. Matter of fact, the 5 major cases that they have of the so-called Neanderthals, ancient man, have all been discredited. You can actually go on our website, nootherdoctrine.org. Go over to the articles page. Go down to the creation versus evolution section and go down to false evidence. There's a PDF file called Fraud and Fantasy article. If you go to that, it'll give you little snippets of these 5 major cases, what they say are ancient man, and you'll see that each one has been disproved. Matter of fact, several out of those 5 were actually just frauds, where they planted evidence, or they filed teeth, or they discolored jaws to try to make them look older, or to pass tests for age that would make them seem to be ancient man, and yet they are legitimately frauds. So you'll see that the evidence in that is really next to none. Hey, if you read closely the evolutionists and their books, they'll admit this. Darwin even admitted this. Do you know that? Darwin admitted this. Let me read you a quote here about that, because most people don't realize that he understood this. Really, in The Origin of Species, in his very book, he said, and I quote this, and this is in page 280, he says, after looking at this and not finding transitional fossil evidence, he says, why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and thus perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Darwin, did you know? He himself said, I don't really see this evidence, and it is a claim against my theory. He expected it to be proved over time. It has not. 150 years of people with money on the line. I mean, that's how they make their living. And they cannot find those transitional fossils. Matter of fact, in the noted, let me get this right, this Harvard professor. I had to look it up because I didn't remember where he was from. But you've probably heard of Stephen Jay Gould. And he's a noted paleontologist. He's from Harvard. His works are out there. He's kind of legendary in their circles. And he's written this in one of his books. He's written, "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however, reasonable, not the evidence of fossils." So what is he saying? Hey, this is the best kept secret in paleontology. We all know this that are in this field. There just isn't the evidence out there. And he says, when you see this tree, this evolutionary tree in your textbook, and you see that there's man here, and then there's the chimp here, and there's Neanderthal here, and all those things that you see, he goes, at the tips where you see the kinds, where you see man, and you see at the node, you see the chimp, he goes, everything else, the intermediates in between those, they're all made up. They're all made up. And he thinks they're reasonable to make this up, but he also admits there's no evidence for them. Hey, when the leaders of the movement, the leaders who are out there saying this is what is fact, and they come back and tell you there's no evidence for that, boy, it should give you reason to pause, shouldn't it? What does the evidence point us to? Well, the evidence points us to creation. Just as God had said that everything is created of its kind and that they reproduce after its kind. And there's no jumping of kinds. And yes, there's variations within the kind. And so you see small variations, and you can see where you have grouped individuals or grouped animals of a kind, and when they just have relations within that group, that you're going to have obvious similarities within that group. So you're going to have hair color or eye shape or skin color, or those things are going to pretty much stay within that group because they're marrying within that group, but they're a part of a larger kind. And we see that as soon as you take it outside of that you get different variations, but they all stay within that kind. So that gives you a look into this, and we want to look at things like punctuated equilibrium. We want to also look at things that they bring up their arguments, vestigial organs, things that, well, your past ancestors needed and used these organs, but you don't use them today. They're meaningless, and therefore it proves evolution. It doesn't, but we'll get to that. We're coming up on a break, and after this break, we'll get to that. And I have an email question coming up as well. And it's about a book that was featured on Oprah and is a bestseller out there. And we'll look at that. And we'll be back after this break.
This is Pastor Scott Tom, host of the podcast Leadership from the Cross and the Bible Answer radio show, No Other Doctrine. Over 8 years of doing our show, I have been asked several key questions over and over. Most Christians don't know how to answer them. Could you answer these questions? Is there a God? Is the Bible true? Why is there evil if God is good? Is Jesus the only way? Is there life after death? Does God allow failure? How do I overcome a sinful habit? We want to teach you how to answer these questions in 7 free emails. Each has an audio file and study notes to follow along. Here's how you get them. Text the word question to 33444. Here's how you do it. Simply open a new text in your phone. In the recipients area, type 33444. In the text area, enter the word question and click send. Or go to crossfellowship.org and click on the guy scratching his head.
We're back in studio, and we welcome your calls. You can call in or send us an email because we do answer your questions on the air. And we do go through this curriculum, so we're a little bit different from some of the call-in shows. We like to go through basically Bible doctrines, and we'll be going through here the doctrine of anthropology, their study of man, on into then the study of sin, and then into the study of salvation. But dealing with the study of man, we're going to touch on things like, where do we get our soul? Do you know? Not that kind of soul, but where do we get our soul? And how is that given to each person? And so we want to look at that, what the Bible has to say about that. And it has a great impact on other areas of thought, including abortion and the purpose of our lives. And so that's one of the things we're going to get into. As we continue on in this, we're looking at evolution versus creationism, or evolutionism versus creationism, and we are seeing that the facts, the evidence for evolution is not there. The facts are actually pointing the opposite direction, that the only viable explanation of how we got here is that God created us, because there isn't a chain of evidence in the fossil record. Some of the evolutionists are switching over to an idea called punctuated equilibrium. And what they're saying here is that over long periods of time, species didn't change, that this was a short, quick change, because we see these species go extinct or arrive just suddenly in the fossil record as far as they think in the geological stratas. And so they're saying that when something cataclysmic happened, a great climate change or something like that happened, then you see a massive change and new species develop, just not gradual, but punctuated suddenly, sudden leaps happening. And so this is their theory. And the problem with this is that it's even harder to believe than graduated over time, because to get this, you're saying that this happened within maybe 1 or 2 generations, that the reptile, that amphibian that's laying that egg, that is like a salamander, that within 1 or 2 generations, that the next egg that hatched is an alligator. Well, it just doesn't happen. We don't see any mechanism that would cause that to happen. And so a lot of the evolutionists are backing away from that, because it's almost more far-fetched than the other, but some still want to hold to it because it fits the fossil record more. And what we see here is that the idea of this happening in such a sudden advance is theoretically impossible, mathematically impossible, genetically impossible. When we look at the genome, when we look at the DNA, we see that it's just far too complex. The amount of information, the massive change that would have to take within the cell structure itself, and all work the very first time, just wouldn't work. And also that would be something that we should be able to observe today, that as a species is going through a radical type of environment change, that you should be able to see something like this take place in their offspring, and it just doesn't. One of the other arguments that they use is the vestigial organs, and these are organs that really is no known purpose for them. And they say in animals, but especially in man, they use man as the prime example of this, that these organs have no known use. And so then they must have been back from our ancestors in a use back then, and that this is proof that because these organs don't have use, proof of evolution, because they're kind of just hanging around and we don't need them. And these are types of organs would be like the tonsils, or at one time they thought this of the adrenaline gland, or the thymus gland, or of different things that are in our body, the spleen. And you'll still see this in textbooks. I know one of my kids has brought this up a couple years ago, that they had this in the textbook and they were reading about this and had questions about this. Well, what about this, Dad? And the answer to that is that they're making leaps of judgment and conclusions, that they're saying, well, there's no use for this organ. Well, just because they don't know of a use doesn't mean that there isn't a use for this organ. For example, tonsils. We do know now that tonsils do fight some infections. And they say, well, you can take them out and you don't really miss them. You can still live a full life and you don't have really any consequences for removing it. Well, that's true, but that doesn't mean that they weren't useful. There are certain things that I can take out of my automobile that seem useless, and the car still runs and I still get from point A to point B, but they can serve a purpose. And we also see that many of these organs are redundant, and not in a bad way, but redundancy, in that if you lose one, another can pick up the slack. Something that for some of us who have things in their computer, you have files in your computer, and you want to back that up. If they're important files, you have redundancy, and so you have like a second hard drive, or you have a tape backup, or you have a CD backup, and that's called redundancy. Not in a bad way, but in a good way, that if you lose one, you can rely on the other. And so we've found that some of these organs, like the spleen or the appendix that you can remove and still live a very normal functioning life, we've found that other organs take up the slack and remove some of the poisons that are in our system or help fight infection. And so we have a very complex system. For example, you can lose a lung and still function. Now, you're not going to be running marathons, but you can still function with one lung or with one kidney. Now, does that mean that lungs or kidneys are useless organs? No, it doesn't. So just because we don't know of a function now doesn't mean that it doesn't have a function. And did you know that when they first came up with this idea that they had almost 100 organs in your body that they didn't know the function for? For example, your tailbone. They said, well, that's left over from the monkeys. But did you know that you actually need your tailbone to sit properly? If you lose your tailbone, that it puts stress on your spine. And so in sitting, that without your tailbone, now you can still sit, but that people who have that part of their body has to be fused or removed, that it causes them lingering problems and pain when sitting. And so even something like that where they say, well, it's unnecessary, it actually balances out the spine and gives support there. And so many of these things are used. Like, for example, when they were first looking at this and they said the appendix is unnecessary, well, you see, they've now discovered that in animals that are vegetarians, they just eat the vegetation, that they have a much larger appendix. And we look at people who are vegetarians, that they eat no meat and very little protein, that they have a larger appendix or even larger blood vessels going to that, meaning that that organ is used more consistently with those individuals than with others. And so that it serves a very unique function. And we don't know exactly why, but now we know that it helps more in the processing of vegetation and taking out poisons and toxins from vegetables, or using those things in a more beneficial way for the body. Who would have thunk it? So there you go. So now we see that these organs fight off different diseases, or, for example, tonsils are much more effective when you're younger than when you're older. That other organs take over, and they think that tonsils are highly effective in taking care of cleansing or protecting you from infections from liquids. And that what happens when you're younger, that normally you're taking in mostly liquids, especially from birth on forward for quite some time. and that it is highly effective then. And so, voila, it really shows the opposite. Not that we have wasted organs. It shows that we're highly complex and organs are interlinked, and God built into us redundancy. So if you do have damage to one organ or an organ gets removed, that other organs oftentimes can step up. But you do have vital organs. You can't remove everything, and otherwise you'd cease to exist. And that kind of answers that. I mean, I think those are very weak arguments for evolution. As we go back and we look through that, and you see that there's a beginning to the universe, that the universe can't be here forever. And if the universe had a beginning, it had to have a beginner. For everything that comes to be must have a cause. And as you look at that, then you say, what fits better? What we see in reality. And evolution just doesn't explain those things. God explains our soul. God explains our feelings of guilt. God explains the high degree of design in our body. And it explains everything as you go down there, but evolution can't explain any of these. And there's a lack of evidence for it. And so now you have just a theory that some of the evolutionists are coming out and saying, even some of the top dogs, and saying, we admit we don't have the evidence here. And it's not just one or two. It's a number of them coming out and saying this. So that gives us reason to believe that this really shouldn't be pushed upon us, that it's not fact, and many try to say, well, this is an established fact. It's far from fact. Matter of fact, there's very little evidence that you can look at. And every evidence that you look at and they say, well, this shows proof for evolution, actually, that you could say is fact, actually fits within the creation design. So there you have it. We're going to deal a little bit with theistic evolution and why some churches hold on to that. But I also want to go out to some emails here. And we have email from Dan. And Dan writes into us. He says, hey, Pastor Scott, I'm dealing with a New Age doctrine that is being taught in a large year-long sales class for Albuquerque realtors. And this class has weaved Rhonda Byrne's top-selling book, The Secret, into its core. The teaching incorporates what they call the law of attraction, and probably many of you maybe have heard this or seen this. This is something I've heard about it a couple times, and I didn't really dig into it. But after this email, I kind of did a little research, and this person was on Oprah, or they had the book and the video on Oprah, and it became a bestseller overnight, and they've sold, I guess, like up to 5 million copies now. And they have about 2 million of the DVDs sold. Well, this law of attraction basically states that everything you need, according to the law of your thought, your environment and financial condition are the perfect reflection of your habitual thinking. Thought rules the world. And then he puts in the email some quotes from the book called The Secret. And it says, here's a quote for you. It says, the earth turns on its orbit for you. The oceans ebb and flow for you. The birds sing for you. The sun rises and sets for you. The stars come out for you. Everything beautiful, every beautiful thing you see, every wondrous thing you experience is all there for you. Take a look around you. None of it can exist without you. No matter who you thought you were, now you know the truth of who you really are. You are the master of the universe. You are the heir of the kingdom. You are the perfection of life. And now you know the secret. And she goes on, you are God in physical body. You are spirit in flesh. You are eternal life expressing itself as you. You are a cosmic being. You are all powerful. You are all wisdom. You are all intelligence. You are perfection. You are magnificence. You are the creator, and you are creating the creation of you on this planet. Wow. I have some thoughts about that, but I'm going to finish up with his email. And Dan says, my question He says several participants and one of the leaders profess Christ and attend church in Albuquerque. All of these individuals believe in the law of attraction, and the doctrine contained in The Secret are biblical. Obviously, they are not. However, these people are buying a lie, and I cannot reach them, as they will not listen to any biblical opposition which I have brought them. Do you have any counsel for me? Well, Dan, that makes for a very difficult situation. And if they've read the actual book and they've read these quotes and they're Christians, you think it would be obvious, because that in itself is very blasphemous, to think that we are God in flesh, that we are the Spirit, that we're all wisdom and all knowledge, and it's really all garbage is what it is. So how could people be pulled into this? Why would they believe this? It just goes back to the original lie, isn't it? And just how gullible people are in believing the lie, and that this is why get-rich-quick schemes work so well, and why self-help books are the number one bestseller time and time again, because we want to improve our image, but really the only way we truly improve our image is coming to Christ and knowing that the one who is supreme, who does control all things, who is all-knowing, is also all-loving, and he loves us. But we see that here this author, Rhonda Byrne, and it's spelled Byrne, but it's pronounced like Byrne. I'm not sure why, but I watched an interview with her, and that's the way they introduced her. But apparently she faced this difficult time in her life and came out of it when she learned this secret. This is kind of like this special thing that nobody else knows, and I know this secret, and if you know this secret, then you can gain everything in your life that you ever really wanted. And so you can have wealth, and you can have prosperity, you can have that husband or that wife that you just truly just, want to have. And so, but you need to know the secret. And so they come out with this same old, it's the same old scam. This is not far from positive confession, the word faith movement, and the name it, claim it. And some of the Eastern mysticism gets into this whole thing that the universe is out there. Certain type of Buddhism gets into this. The idea of using the Force is the same type of idea from Star Wars, that you can manipulate the universe, and there's good vibes and there's bad vibes. So you can be either a good Sith or a bad Sith, And when you think positive things or use it in a good way, that you'll gain success and good things will come to you and the universe will provide it. And so this is the whole thing. And so she goes into this law of attraction, and Byrne, I guess, says that it's the most powerful law in the universe, and that it brings about the logical manifestations of your predominant thoughts and feelings and words. This gives people direct control over their lives. A person's thoughts, whether conscious or unconscious, and feelings bring about corresponding positive or negative manifestations. Positive thoughts bring about positive manifestations, while negative thoughts bring about negative manifestations. So the theory is simple, and it's absolute. The law of attraction always responds to your thoughts, no matter what they are. Your thoughts become things, and you're the most powerful person, or thoughts are the most powerful power in the universe, simply because whatever you think about will come to be. And so that's what she states. And of course, she quotes scripture, as they all do. Everybody who wants to bring up a false doctrine or some weird new religion or thought, they all go to the Bible to try to prove their point and lend some authority to what they believe. So she quotes Jesus without ever saying it's Jesus. And obviously they don't quote the whole Bible, because it would point out that what she's teaching is heresy. But they quote Matthew 21:22, whatsoever you ask in prayer, believing you shall receive. And so that's basically the law summed up. And so she says, point 1, know what you want and ask the universe for it. 2, feel and behave as if the object of your desire is on its way. And 3, be open to receiving it. And if you do those things, you'll get what you want. If you don't do those things, well, it's your fault and only bad things will come your way. Matter of fact, she says, stay away from people with bad thoughts or bad feelings. She warns listeners not to speak about their illness or to visit somebody with an illness or to visit somebody with negative thoughts because that's going to rub off on you in your life. She warns people against sacrifice for either personal or financial. In other words, don't give to the poor, don't give to the needy, because you're kind of professing your belief in poverty, and only poverty will come to you. And think of yourself first and only, look out only for yourself and your self-interest, and put yourself ahead of everybody else. And that's the philosophy. Basically, the earth turns for you, and you're the center of the universe, basically. And so this is some of the same garbage that went out with Shirley MacLaine's book, Out on a Limb. And you're really out on a broken limb if you believe this. And so I'll answer this, Dan, and for the rest of you who may know somebody who's reading this book or has the DVD, The Secret, when we get back from this break, I'll go over some techniques that you can use to confront people who are into this. So we'll be back after this break.
Do you want a deep walk with God and be used by Him? Do you want to learn from the best professors, pastors, and thought leaders in Christianity today? You can do this at a low cost and at your own pace at ccfcollege.com. It is a completely different type of school. The tests are about growing in character, not grades. We will add to your knowledge, but we really want to transform your life. Similar programs would cost you $18,000. However, the first 200 students in our program will get in for only $47 a month. After that, the price will go up. For information, text CCF College to 33444. That's CCF College to 33444. Or go to ccfcollege.com. That's ccfcollege.com.
We're back and looking at the book and video called The Secret. And since 5 million copies were sold, you probably know somebody who has a copy of that. And basically here, this author, Rhonda Byrne, says that your God manifest in flesh, and your thoughts are the most powerful thing because they create things. And if you think bad thoughts, bad things will come to you. If you think good thoughts, good things will come to you. She even goes so far as to say that tragedy and those things are caused by bad thoughts. Well, you have to leap and say then 9/11 happened because those people were thinking bad thoughts in the Twin Towers. And how terrible is that? But that's the reality of her doctrine, so to speak. Well, does the Bible actually teach this? No. And so if you're dealing with a Christian, hopefully they're open to Scripture, and you take them to Scripture. And if they're quoting Jesus, obviously the best place to start is with Jesus. Did Jesus say, put yourself first and think of only yourself first, and don't be around the sick, and don't be around people with negative thoughts? That's just the opposite, isn't it? You can probably think of verses on your own, but Jesus said the first shall be last. Matter of fact, in Mark 9:35, he says, and he sat down with the 12, and he said to them, if anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all. In other words, the way to be first is to not put yourself first, but put yourself last and become a servant, because actually that's what Jesus did. His whole life was about servanthood. And what about visiting the sick or somebody in prison? In Matthew 25, Jesus talked about that. And he told them this parable. And in Matthew 25:34, he says, then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. And I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of my brethren, you did it to me. Then he will say to those on the left hand, now listen to this, depart from me, you cursed, into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. As I was a stranger and you did not take me in, naked and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison and you did not visit me. Then they will also answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and we didn't minister to you? Then he will answer, saying to them, assuredly, I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And here's his conclusion. Oh, you guys just blew it. That's okay. You were thinking negative thoughts. I forgive you. No, he didn't say that, does he? Verse 46, and he says, and these will go away into everlasting punishment, and the righteous into eternal life. So it's just the opposite of what she's teaching. One of the things that you need to establish a doctrine, and I've taught this before, is you don't go just on some verses. You also go by what actually happened, the actions of God, the actions of the apostles, not just what is taught, because you can manipulate words. So how do you know exactly what the words mean? You can do word studies and break it down, but those can be manipulated. What you look at is the actions. Who does God call righteous? How did they act? Who does the Bible call evil, and how did they act? How does it fit up with the doctrine? So if you look at this, we also see that God is the only one who manifested in a physical body, and that is Jesus. But did the righteous people, the people that the Bible commends, did they follow this doctrine? And what we see here is that the people who you would think, according to the secret, would have followed that, like Peter and Paul and Job and others who are called righteous, did they actually follow this so-called doctrine of the secret, the secret that she quotes from the Bible? No, they didn't. We see that every one of these individuals that are called righteous by God, that they all suffered. And so you'd have to say that, well, I guess they were just thinking negative thoughts. But Jesus, who is God, manifest in the flesh, he also suffered, didn't he? And he suffered, and that was a good thing, because we gained redemption by it. Matter of fact, when you look and go through the champions of the faith, Hebrews chapter 11, and it goes through and begins to name all these people, it says in there that each one suffered. And matter of fact, it says because they suffered, the world was unworthy of them. That God thought that they were elevated in God's eyes because they suffered for righteousness' sake. But what about the other people who actually thought of themselves, thought that they were creating this great world? It was all about them. It's about me, me, me. I'm God in the flesh. What happened to those people? Well, think about Nebuchadnezzar in the Old Testament. And he was standing before him, looking out over his magnificent kingdom, and he's saying, look what I built. This is all about me. I did this. I'm the creator of my own universe, basically, is what he's saying, right? And God says, oh, bad idea. You shouldn't think that way. And therefore, I'm going to make you wander around like a wild beast for 7 years. Your hair's going to grow out. It's going to be clotted together like feathers. Your nails are going to grow out. And you're going to lose your kingship for those 7 years until you recognize that I alone am God. And what about Herod? Herod was sitting there, and remember, this is later on in Acts, not the Herod of Jesus' time, the different Herod. He's out there, and the people are called him together, and they wanted to hear him speak. Oh, you're a great orator. Oh, it's like the words of a God. And they're all hailing him as God, and he's there taking this all in. Yeah, this is great. I'm a speaker like God, like I descended from heaven. And God says, wrong way to think. And what did he do? Sent an angel who struck him, and he was eaten inside out by worms. And so he died. So how do we see this play out? Well, you see the two things here. Anytime you see this, well, if they're not Christians, or if they're Christians and they're not going to accept that, what are they going to do? And here's a couple things that you can do. These are techniques that we're working on to put into a seminar later on, a No Other Doctrine seminar, and you'll see that anything that's brought up that is contrary to Scripture, it's always going to fall into a couple different areas. It's going to be illogical, or it's going to be self-refuting, or it's going to be absurd. And so I want to teach people these techniques. One is it's going to be self-refuting. And it fits into all three of these categories. This thing is so off the wall that it falls apart in every different area. So, Dan, what you want to do is show that it's self-refuting. In other words, she comes up and she says that all religions are the same. They're all equal. And we know that the very thing that can't be true. You can't have things that are contradictory that are equal. So you can't say that the car is painted red on the outside when it's actually blue. They're not equal. And so you can't say that Christianity and Islam are the same, because Christianity said Jesus died on the cross. Islam says Jesus didn't die on the cross. They're contradictory. They're not the same. So you can bring up those things that are self-refuting, or the other thing that I recommend that you do is you bring it to its logical conclusion. In other words, you show that it's absurd, that it doesn't fit into the real world. This is what I call bringing it into the real world, or taking it for a test drive. And so they say, your thoughts bring things into reality because you're basically God in the flesh, although you, I guess, forgot, you don't know it. Same thing Shirley MacLaine did. You used to have to pay $300 to go find out that you're God. And it really, really is funny. So what you do is you take it for a test drive. So they say, okay, your thoughts bring about reality. So that brings what you're thinking into the real world. And so the thought I had about this is that, okay, you ask them, for example, and we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to speed this up. But for example, if your thoughts bring everything into existence, and if you're thinking just about yourself and putting yourself forward, then it lends some problems here. For example, I remember several doctors, but one in Florida he's a dentist, and he used to put women under sedation and then rape them. Okay, so if he's commander of his universe, then you have to ask a question, are the dentists right then in doing this? Because obviously they were thinking that. Well, if you say no, that was wrong, then you have to also say then why is the universe bringing that into fruition? Why is his thoughts coming about that cause these women to be raped? And what about the women? You'd have to say that the women deserve this because they were thinking about rape then, or they had secret desired for this to happen then, right? So in other words, when you play this out, that's obviously wrong. And so when it plays out, it doesn't work. And so what you end up with is that if the person is saying this is my universe and I'm thinking this and this is what I want and I'm thinking about sex and they do that, then you have to say then this is something that is shameful. And when it plays out in the real world and people want to use this, you basically have to shame them into it. And this is like, let me give you another example to bring this into perspective. People who say, well, I think abortion is wrong, but I don't feel I'm in a place to tell them what to do. I can't be judge over them. Or I think abortion is wrong, but I wouldn't have one. Well, what you have to do is define that for them. So you have to bring them out and say, well, why do you think abortion is wrong? Well, I think it's wrong because it's taking the life of a baby. Okay, so let me restate this for you. So what you're saying is you believe that it's okay for other women to kill their baby, but you don't think it's your place to tell them that's wrong. You think it's wrong, but it's something you wouldn't do, but it's okay for them. And when you put it that way, it sounds so horrible. So what you have to say is, if you believe in this, you'd have to believe that it's okay and it's good for dentists to go ahead and rape women who are under sedation, or that the women brought this upon themselves. And either way, it's reprehensible to think about that. And so you have to say, this is what you actually believe. So we ran out of time. I couldn't really explain it as much as I wanted to, but if you have questions about this and this technique, basically it's what Nathan did to David. And you bring like a story or a reality out, and when they're saying, no, that's wrong, or no, that's not right, then you say, well, it's exactly what you did, or that's exactly what you believe, or it's exactly what the book teaches. And that shames him into that. Anyways, we're past due, so we're going to have to say see you next week, and blessed wishes to you.
Thanks for joining us for No Other Doctrine. To find out more about Pastor Scott Tom and the ministry of Cross Christian Fellowship, make sure to visit the website at crossfellowship.org. We do hope you'll join us again next time as we continue to explore why the doctrine of God is the only doctrine that can bring eternal life. You've been listening to No Other Doctrine with Pastor Scott Tom. For more information, visit crossfellowship.org.